Good evening, and welcome. Do come in and settle yourself comfortably, perhaps with a cup of tea at your elbow, for this is not a tale that wants to be rushed. Tonight, I bring you to a quiet corner of England, to a sitting room, warm with lamplight and the soft click of knitting needles, where a circle of women has gathered, as they do every week, to gossip a little, to stitch a little, and to imagine, no doubt, that nothing very much ever happens in such a place. But before the fire has quite died down, one of their number will be found dead in her favourite chair, a needle buried where no needle ought to be. The others will call it an accident. Miss Marple will not. For in a circle of old friends, someone has been keeping a secret far sharper than any needle, and it will take a gentle old lady with sharp blue eyes and sharper instincts to unravel it. So do stay a while. Pour yourself another cup, and let us begin. The last stitch of the evening. It was a damp Thursday evening in October, the kind that settles over an English village like a grey shawl, when the ladies of the St. Mary Mead Wednesday Wool Circle, for so it was called, though it met, by long-standing confusion, on a Thursday, gathered as they had done every week for the better part of 11 years, in the drawing-room of Miss Amelia Prentice. The room was not large, but it was comfortable in the particular way that rooms become comfortable only through long habitation. A fire burned in the grate, not extravagantly, for Miss Prentice was careful with her coal, but enough to take the chill from the air and to catch, now and again, the glint of a needle as it caught the light. 6 women sat about the room in a loose half-circle, their chairs drawn close to the hearth, baskets of wool at their feet, and upon their laps the beginnings and endings of a dozen small garments, mufflers for the church jumble, matinee jackets for Mrs. Latimer's new grandchild, and, in the case of old Miss Bunthorne, a scarf of such indeterminate length and dubious colour that it had become something of a private joke among the circle, never so unkind as to be spoken of when she was not looking, and only a very little unkind when she was not there at all. Miss Marple sat near the window, a little apart from the fire, for she had always preferred, as she said, to keep one eye upon the room and one upon the garden, though on an October evening there was precious little to be seen of the garden beyond the darkening shapes of the hollyhocks against the glass. She was not, strictly speaking, a founding member of the circle. That distinction belonged to Miss Prentice and to the late Mrs. Hartnell, dead now these 3 years, but she had joined so long ago that no one quite remembered a time before her, and her chair, an old cane one with a faded cushion, had become as much a fixture of Thursday evenings as the tea-tray itself. "I do think," said Mrs. Latimer, holding up a half-finished booty and regarding it with the critical eye of a woman who has unpicked the same 3 rows 4 times, "that this pattern is a great deal more complicated than dear Ethel made it sound." "Ethel always makes things sound simpler than they are," said Miss Prentice, without looking up from her own work. "She has a great gift for it. I remember when she persuaded the vicar that the flower show could be moved forward a fortnight with no trouble at all, and then there we all were, up to our elbows in dahlias that hadn't the sense to bloom on schedule." There was a ripple of soft laughter at this, the comfortable laughter of women who have shared a great many Thursday evenings and a great many small jokes, worn smooth with repetition, like stones in a stream. Ethel Bantry, for it was of her they spoke, and she sat among them, quite unbothered by the teasing, being a woman not easily put out of countenance, merely smiled and said, "Well, and the dahlias came up beautifully in the end, so I don't see that anyone has cause for complaint." She was a handsome woman still, though past 60, with the kind of high colour and decided manner that had made her, for as long as anyone could remember, the unofficial arbiter of the circle's small disputes, whose turn it was to bring the biscuits, whether the church raffle should have 3 prizes or 5, and other matters of similarly weighty consequence. She sat now in the best chair in the room, a deep armchair with wings, upholstered in a faded rose chintz, which had stood in that particular corner of Miss Prentice's drawing-room for as long as the circle had existed, and which had become, by unspoken but universal agreement, Ethel's chair, in very much the way that certain pews in certain churches belong, by right of long occupation, to certain families. "You've dropped a stitch, Amelia," said Miss Bunthorne suddenly, peering across at her hostess's work with the satisfaction of a woman who has spotted an error in someone else's knitting, which is, after all, one of the purer pleasures available to devoted knitters. "I have not," said Miss Prentice, counting rapidly. "Oh, I have. Bother." "It's the light," said Mrs. Latimer sympathetically. "I always say we ought to have a stronger bulb in here, Amelia, though I know it's your house and not my place to say so." "It's not the light," said Miss Prentice, a shade tartly, for she did not care to be told the deficiencies of her own drawing-room. "It's this wretched pattern. I don't know why Ethel had to choose something so fiddly for the church sale. Plain garter stitch never gave anyone a moment's trouble." "Plain garter stitch," said Ethel comfortably, "doesn't fetch sixpence more at a jumble sale than a plain grey muffler, and I am told we are trying to raise money for a new roof, not merely to keep our hands occupied." There was, Miss Marple thought, watching this exchange with her needles moving steadily and almost without her conscious attention, always a small undercurrent to these Thursday evenings. Nothing one could put a name to, nothing that a stranger glancing in at the window would have noticed at all, but present nonetheless, the way a very faint draught is present in an old house even when every window is shut. It was not quite unkindness. It was something more like the accumulated friction of a great many years of close acquaintance, in which every small habit of every woman present had long since become known to all the others, and had, in the knowing, become also a small and permanent source of gentle irritation. Mrs. Latimer, for instance, had never in 11 years finished a garment without unpicking it at least twice, and had never in 11 years failed to announce the fact aloud, as though it were a fresh misfortune each time. Miss Bunthorne's scarf had achieved, over the better part of 2 years, a length that suggested she meant to knit until Judgment Day, and everyone privately suspected this was because Miss Bunthorne had discovered that a woman perpetually knitting the same scarf need never be troubled with beginning anything new, and so could sit through the evening's gossip with her hands occupied and her opinions largely unspoken. And Ethel Bantry, well, Ethel had opinions on everything, and had held her chair by the fire, quite literally, for 11 years, and there were those, though Miss Marple would not have named them even to herself in so many words, who found this a very small thing to have minded for so long, and minded it rather more than a very small thing perhaps deserved. "Where is Dorothy tonight?" asked Mrs. Latimer, glancing round the room, as though she had only just noticed the gap. "Her chest again," said Miss Prentice. "She sent a note round this afternoon. I do think she frets over that chest of hers more than the doctor would like her to, but there it is. And Constance? Visiting her sister in Much Benham. She'll be back Sunday." So there were, this particular Thursday, only the 6 of them: Miss Prentice, Mrs. Latimer, Miss Bunthorne, Ethel Bantry, a quiet young woman named Susan Hale, who had moved to the village only the previous spring and had joined the circle with the particular eagerness of the newly arrived, and Miss Marple herself. The evening passed as such evenings pass, with tea at 8:30, brought in by Miss Prentice's daily woman before she went home, and with talk that ranged from the price of wool to the vicar's sermon to a rather delicious piece of speculation, indulged in by everyone but contributed to most enthusiastically by Mrs. Latimer, concerning whether the new people at the old mill house were really married at all, or only said they were. "I'm sure I don't see that it's any business of ours," said Ethel Bantry, in the tone of a woman thoroughly enjoying a piece of business that was, by her own admission, none of hers. It was gone 10 o'clock when the circle broke up, as it always did, with a good deal of folding of wool and hunting for dropped needles, and the small confusion of 6 women rising at once and reaching for coats that had got themselves tangled together on the hall stand. "You're not walking back alone, Jane," said Mrs. Latimer to Miss Marple, drawing on her gloves. "I have my torch," said Miss Marple placidly, "and it is not above 10 minutes, and I have walked it in the dark a great many times before, without coming to any harm." "You are very kind to think of it, though." Ethel Bantry was the last to rise from her chair, as she generally was, having settled a final point about the church sale to her own satisfaction. The prizes were to be 3, not 5, and that was the end of the matter. She gathered her wool into its basket, remarked that her feet were troubling her rather this evening, and she thought she would sit just a moment longer by the fire before facing the cold, and told the others not to wait for her, as Amelia would see her out. "I'll only be 5 minutes," she said comfortably, settling back into the wings of the rose-chintz armchair with the particular satisfaction of a woman in her own accustomed place. "Go along, all of you, before you catch your deaths standing about in that hall." And so they went, Mrs. Latimer and Miss Bunthorne together as far as the crossroads, Susan Hale in the opposite direction, and Miss Marple, with her torch and her stick, walking slowly homeward through the damp October dark, thinking of nothing more troubling than whether she had left the drawing-room window latched, and quite unaware, as none of them were aware, that Ethel Bantry, sitting alone by Amelia Prentice's dying fire, with her feet up and her eyes, very likely, already half closed, would never rise from that chair again. The woman in the armchair. It was Miss Prentice who found her, and it was Miss Prentice's scream, a short, strangled sort of sound, quite unlike her usual composed manner, that brought her daily woman running back from the gate, where she had got no farther than the second post on her way home before she heard it. Afterwards, when she had occasion to tell the story a great many times, to a great many people, Miss Prentice could never quite explain what had first told her that something was wrong. She had gone back into the drawing-room, she said, merely to bank the fire before going up to bed, expecting to find Ethel gone, for she had assumed, when she came down from seeing Mrs. Latimer's coat sorted from Miss Bunthorne's, that Ethel had let herself out the front door, as she sometimes did, being of an independent turn of mind and disliking a fuss made over her. But Ethel was still there, in the wing chair by the fire, her feet up on the little needlework stool as she had left them, her head fallen a little to one side against the wing of the chair, in an attitude that might, for one merciful half-second, have passed for sleep. It was the knitting needle that told Miss Prentice it was not sleep. It stood upright from Ethel Bantry's chest, a good 4 inches of grey steel catching the last of the firelight, and there was a dark stain spread across the front of her blue wool cardigan that had not been there an hour before. The doctor, young Dr. Haydock, who had taken over the practice from his father only 2 years previously and had not, in that time, been called upon to deal with anything more alarming than the annual outbreak of influenza and Mrs. Pruitt's imaginary heart trouble, arrived within the half-hour, summoned by Miss Prentice's daily woman, who had shown, in the circumstances, considerably more presence of mind than her employer, having gone directly to the telephone box on the corner rather than standing about wringing her hands, which was Miss Prentice's own contribution to the crisis for a good 10 minutes after the event. Constable Palk arrived shortly after the doctor, breathless from his bicycle and considerably out of his depth, for nothing of this kind had occurred in St. Mary Mead within his memory of service there, and his training had not, on the whole, prepared him for a dead woman with a knitting needle in her chest, found in a respectable drawing-room among the ladies of the wool circle. "Now then," he said, in the voice he used for settling disputes about stray chickens, which was the nearest thing to authority he could summon at short notice, "nobody's to touch anything, if you please." This instruction came a little late, as Miss Prentice had already touched a good deal, in the first horrified moments of discovery, including Ethel's hand, which she had seized in some confused notion of feeling for a pulse, and the needle itself, which she had very nearly pulled free before some instinct, she could not afterwards say what, had stopped her. By the time Dr. Haydock had made his examination, word had somehow travelled, as word does in a village, and Mrs. Latimer had reappeared at the door, still in her outdoor coat, her face white, insisting that she simply could not go home and leave poor Amelia alone with all this. Miss Bunthorne came with her, less from any great affection for Miss Prentice than from an unwillingness to be left out of whatever was happening, which was, in fairness, a fault common to a great many people, and not confined to Miss Bunthorne alone. "She must have fallen on it," said Mrs. Latimer, for perhaps the 4th time, standing in the doorway of the drawing-room with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes fixed, with a kind of horrified fascination, on the chair by the fire, from which the doctor's bag now obscured the worst of the sight. She must have, Amelia, she must have fallen. She said her feet were troubling her. She must have got up to reach something and fallen back into the chair, and the needle— I don't see how a person could fall on a needle in such a way, said Miss Bunthorne, with the particular relish of a woman for once in possession of more sense than her neighbour, and have it go in so deep and so straight. If you ask me— Nobody is asking you, Agnes, said Mrs. Latimer, with some asperity, for even in the midst of shock, old habits of mild irritation reassert themselves, and I don't think this is the moment. I am only saying, said Miss Bunthorne, undeterred, that it seems very odd. It was at this point that Miss Marple arrived, summoned by Susan Hale, who had run the length of the village in the dark and the damp to fetch her, on the not unreasonable theory that Miss Marple, of all of them, would know what ought to be done, and would not, at any rate, stand about wringing her hands or saying unhelpful things about how odd it all seemed. Miss Marple came in quietly, in her old grey coat with her umbrella still dripping a little from the walk, and stood for a moment in the doorway taking in the scene, with the same unhurried attention she generally gave to a new pattern of knitting or an unfamiliar bird at her bird table, which is to say, without any outward sign of the intense and particular interest she was, in fact, applying to every detail before her. "My dear Amelia," she said, going to Miss Prentice and taking her hand, for Miss Prentice, though composed enough now to speak sense, was trembling a good deal. "What a dreadful shock for you. Do sit down, my dear. Susan, is there any brandy in the house? I think a little brandy would do Amelia a great deal of good, and perhaps Mrs. Latimer as well, if I may say so." This practical suggestion had the effect of giving Susan Hale something useful to do, and of settling Mrs. Latimer, who accepted a small glass with the air of a woman doing something faintly improper but necessary in the circumstances, into a chair well away from the fireplace. Dr. Haydock straightened up from his examination and came across to where Constable Palk stood, notebook in hand, and looking, on the whole, rather as though he wished very much that this particular difficulty had waited for a more senior officer to be available. "Well, Doctor," said the constable in a low voice that nevertheless carried perfectly well across the small room, for Miss Marple, though apparently occupied in settling a cushion behind Miss Prentice's back, had excellent hearing and had never seen any particular virtue in not using it. "She's been dead the best part of an hour, I should think," said Dr. Haydock. "The needle's gone in between the 4th and 5th ribs, straight to the heart, near enough. Whoever it was knew where to put it, or was extraordinarily lucky. You don't think it was an accident then, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock hesitated. He was a careful man, and did not care to commit himself further than the facts allowed, but he had also, in his 2 years in the village, come to have a considerable respect for plain speaking. "I couldn't tell you how it happened, one way or the other, not with any certainty," he said. "It's possible, just possible, that a fall or some sudden movement could have driven a needle in like that, if she'd had it in her hand, or in her lap, point upward. People have died from stranger accidents than that. But I'll tell you frankly, Palk, I don't much care for the angle of it. It's gone in very straight and very deliberate looking for an accident." "There now," said Mrs. Latimer, who had heard this last exchange, despite the doctor's lowered voice, and who found in it, oddly, a kind of comfort. "You see, it might very well have been an accident, just as I said. She would fidget with her needles even when she wasn't knitting. I've seen her do it 100 times, tapping them together or holding one up to the light. She might easily have had one in her hand when it happened." "She might," agreed Miss Bunthorne, in the tone of a woman not at all convinced but prepared, for the moment, to let the matter rest. "Though I still say it seems very odd that a person tapping a needle against her hand should manage to drive it 4 inches into her own chest without so much as crying out, and no one in the hall to hear her if she had." There was a small silence at this, into which nobody cared to speak, for it was, put so plainly, a difficult thing to argue against. Miss Marple said nothing at all. She had moved, in her quiet way, a little nearer to the fireplace, ostensibly to see that the fireguard was properly in place, for she had a horror, she said, of sparks on an evening like this, with everyone so distracted. But her pale blue eyes, resting for a moment on the small sewing table beside Ethel Bantry's chair, on which lay a neat coil of grey wool and a small tin of pins and, beside it, a single knitting needle of the size that matches a pear, had taken in a great deal more than the fireguard, and had already begun, in their gentle and unhurried fashion, the slow work of noticing that would not, for some days yet, resolve itself into anything so definite as a thought. "Constable," she said presently, in her mild way, "I wonder if I might ask, has anyone thought to look for the other needle?" Constable Palk turned to her with the faint air of a man who had not, until that moment, considered that there ought to be another needle at all. "The other one, Miss Marple?" "Well," said Miss Marple, "a pair of knitting needles is generally sold, and generally used, 2 at a time, Constable. If poor Ethel had one needle out, in her lap, or in her hand, as Mrs. Latimer suggests, one would rather expect to find its fellow somewhere close by, unless, of course, she had put it down somewhere else entirely, which would be a little unlike her, for she was always most particular about keeping her pairs together. She used to say to me that a lost needle was worse than a dropped stitch, because at least a dropped stitch you could always pick up again." Nobody answered her for a moment. Constable Palk looked round the hearthrug and under the little sewing table with the expression of a man who has just been handed a task he does not fully understand the purpose of, and Dr. Haydock looked at Miss Marple with the beginning of an expression that, in a less controlled man, might have been called sharp interest. "There doesn't seem to be another one here, Miss Marple," said the constable at last, straightening up. "Not that I can see." "No," said Miss Marple, folding her hands and looking into the fire with an air of perfect placidity. "No, I didn't think there would be. A needle out of place. The inquest was held 3 days later in the back room of the Blue Boar, which served, as it had served for as long as anyone could remember, as the nearest thing St. Mary Mead possessed to a court of law. The verdict, after a good deal of careful and inconclusive evidence from Dr. Haydock, and a rather less careful and considerably more confused account from Miss Prentice, who had never in her life given evidence before a coroner and found the experience thoroughly unsettling, was returned as an open one, that Ethel Bantry had died of a wound inflicted by a knitting needle, and that there was, at present, insufficient evidence to say whether this had been accident, misadventure, or something graver. It was not, on the whole, a verdict that satisfied anybody, and it satisfied Miss Marple least of all, though she said very little about it at the time, beyond remarking to her nephew Raymond, who happened to telephone from London that week on some quite unconnected matter, that she thought the coroner had been a very sensible man not to commit himself further than the facts allowed, though I dare say it will leave a great deal of unpleasant talk in the village, which is always what happens when a thing is left open. For her own part, Miss Marple had begun, in her quiet way, to think about very little else. It was not that she disbelieved in accidents. She had lived a great many years in St. Mary Mead, and had observed, over the course of them, that accidents did happen, that people did, on occasion, sit upon things they ought not to have sat upon, and drop things upon themselves that they ought to have put safely away, and that human carelessness, far from being a rare and remarkable thing, was in fact one of the great engines of daily life, responsible for a very great deal more mischief than most people supposed. But an accident, to be believed, had to make sense in its details, and it was the details of this one that would not, however Miss Marple turned them over, arrange themselves into any pattern she found satisfactory. She had gone back, 2 days after the inquest, to call upon Miss Prentice, ostensibly to see how the poor woman was bearing up, for it is a hard thing to have had a death in one's own drawing-room, however little one is to blame for it, and Amelia Prentice was not a woman of particularly strong nerves, but in reality, though she would not have put it to herself in quite such plain terms, to look once more at the chair by the fire, and at the little table beside it, and to ask a few questions that seemed, on the surface, no more than the natural curiosity of an old friend. "I don't like to think of it, Jane, if you don't mind," said Miss Prentice, who had had the chair moved to the far side of the room, though she could not quite bring herself to have it removed from the house altogether, it having been in the family, in one corner or another, for the better part of 40 years. "I keep thinking, if only I hadn't gone up to see Mrs. Latimer's coat, if only I'd stayed in the room a few minutes longer." "You mustn't think such things, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "If you had stayed in the room, it is quite possible that whatever happened would not have happened at all that evening, but only some other evening instead, and then you would have been in the room, and I don't at all like to think what might have become of you. It does no good at all to imagine oneself into a tragedy after the fact. I have seen a great deal of that sort of thing, and it never once made anybody feel better, or changed anything that had already occurred." This was, in its way, a comfort, though not perhaps the sort of comfort Miss Prentice had expected, and she looked at her old friend with something between gratitude and mild surprise. "You don't think, then," she said, lowering her voice a little, though there was no one else in the room to hear, "that it really was an accident?" "Constable Palk seems to think it very likely was, whatever the coroner said. He told my Ada only yesterday that in his opinion Ethel had simply been careless, holding a needle up when she oughtn't, and given herself a fright at the last, and fallen back into the chair too hard." "Constable Palk is a very worthy young man," said Miss Marple, in the tone of one paying a compliment that was not, perhaps, entirely unqualified. "But I don't think he has had a great deal of experience of needlework, or he would know that one does not generally sit holding a single needle upright in one's hand for any length of time, with nothing on it, and no wool in progress. It is an awkward thing to hold, and not at all a natural thing to be doing, sitting alone by a fire with one's feet up, resting after an evening's company. Now, if she had been knitting when it happened, that would be a different matter altogether. One does sometimes wave a needle about without thinking, mid-row, if one is talking, or thinking of something else." "But Ethel wasn't knitting when she died, was she, Amelia? Her work was folded up quite neatly in her basket, I noticed, with the needles run through it in the usual way, both together, just as one leaves off when one means to stop for the evening." Miss Prentice frowned, trying to remember. Yes, I believe you're right. I noticed her basket sitting there so neatly, and I remember thinking, at the time, how strange it was that everything should look so ordinary when—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, and pressed her handkerchief for a moment to her lips. "Then the needle that killed her," said Miss Marple, in the same mild, unhurried voice she might have used to remark upon the weather, "was not taken from her own work at all. It was a separate needle, brought to that chair from somewhere else, or already lying somewhere near it, and used quite apart from anything Ethel herself was doing at the time." "That does not sound to me very much like an accident, Amelia, however it may have looked to poor Constable Palk." There was a silence in the little drawing-room, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, and, somewhere outside, the distant and cheerful sound of a dog, barking at nothing in particular. "But Jane," said Miss Prentice at last, in a voice not much above a whisper, "if that's so, if someone brought that needle to her, on purpose, then it must have been one of us. There was no one else in the house, no one else came near her, all evening, but the 6 of us, and I let each of you out myself, or saw you go, every one, except Ethel, who stayed behind. It couldn't have been anyone else." "No," agreed Miss Marple, gathering up her gloves with an air of perfect composure that concealed, as it generally did, a great deal of careful thought going on beneath the surface. "No, my dear, I am very much afraid it couldn't." She did not say, because it seemed to her too soon and too unkind a thing to say aloud to a woman so evidently distressed, that she had already begun, in her own mind, the far more delicate business of considering which of the 5 women who had sat with Ethel Bantry that Thursday evening might have had, tucked away somewhere among the small resentments and old habits of 11 years' close acquaintance, a reason sharp enough to match the needle. It was on her way home, walking slowly along the lane in the pale afternoon light, with her basket over her arm, that Miss Marple stopped quite suddenly, as though struck by a thought, and stood for a moment quite still, looking at nothing in particular. She was thinking of the needle itself, not the wound it had made, which was Dr. Haydock's proper business and not hers, but the needle as an object, a thing with a history and an owner, as every needle in every work-basket in the village had a history and an owner, if one troubled to ask. She had looked at it, in that first dreadful hour, only long enough to see that it was there. She had not looked at it closely enough to say, with any confidence, whose it might have been. And this, she told herself, walking on again, with a rather more purposeful step than before, was a very great omission, and one she intended, at the first opportunity, to correct. For if Ethel's own pair had lain undisturbed in her work-basket, folded up neatly as a woman folds up her work when she means to stop for the night, then the needle that had killed her had come from somewhere else, from someone else's basket, someone else's pair, broken now into a single needle with its fellow missing, tucked away perhaps in a drawer, or a coat pocket, or the bottom of a knitting bag, waiting, if only one knew where to look for it, to tell its own small and damning story. Old friends, old grudges. Miss Marple had long held the private opinion, never much aired beyond the confines of her own drawing-room, that a village was very much like a pond, placid enough on the surface, so that a stranger looking in might suppose nothing at all was happening beneath it. And yet, if one had the patience to sit quite still and watch for long enough, one began to see a great deal of movement going on below, some of it quite old, and none of it, on the whole, particularly surprising to anyone who had troubled to look. She spent the better part of the following week doing what she always did in such circumstances, which was very little that could be called investigation in any formal sense, and a great deal that consisted of small calls and cups of tea, and the sort of unhurried conversation in which a good deal may be learned by a person patient enough to let others talk themselves into revealing more than they intended. She began, as it happened, with Mrs. Latimer, chiefly because Mrs. Latimer was, of all the circle, the easiest to call upon without any particular excuse being required, being herself so constitutionally fond of a chat that she generally supplied both sides of it before her visitor had properly sat down. "I still can't think of it without going quite cold, Jane," said Mrs. Latimer, pouring tea with a hand that trembled very slightly, whether from the memory or merely from the effort of holding the pot steady while she talked, it was difficult to say. Poor Ethel. Whatever one may have thought of her, and I don't say I always agreed with her, about the prizes and so on, you know how she would have her own way about the smallest things, one never wished her any harm. It does seem so very wicked, if it wasn't an accident after all. You knew her a long time, I think, said Miss Marple, accepting her cup. Oh, a great many years. We came to the village within a 12-month of each other, she and I, though I don't think either of us cared to remember exactly how many years ago that was. Mrs. Latimer laughed, a little unsteadily. We were quite close once, before she took up so entirely with poor Amelia and the wool circle and all the church committees. I sometimes thought, well, it doesn't do to speak ill of the dead, does it? But I sometimes thought Ethel liked best to be in charge of things, and I am not a woman who cares for being told what to do, not even by an old friend, and so we drifted apart a little over the years. Nothing unfriendly in it, just drifted. That happens very often between old friends, said Miss Marple comfortably. I don't think it need mean anything unkind at all. Tell me, my dear, did Ethel ever have any particular difficulty with anyone else in the circle? I don't mean the ordinary small frictions one has with anybody one sees every week. I mean anything a little more pointed. Mrs. Latimer hesitated, and in the hesitation Miss Marple read, with the ease of long practice, that there was in fact something to tell, and that Mrs. Latimer was merely deciding how much of it she cared to be responsible for having said. Well, she said at last, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the room. I don't like to make anything of it, because I'm sure it was all settled long ago and forgotten. But there was some unpleasantness, years back now, between Ethel and Agnes Bunthorne. Over a man, if you can believe it, though it seems a very long time ago for either of them to have been troubling themselves over such things. Agnes was engaged, you know, before she came to St. Mary Mead, to a Mr. Fenwick, I believe the name was, and it was said, though I never had it from either of them directly, that Ethel had had something to do with the engagement being broken off, written to him, or some such thing, telling him things about Agnes that weren't at all kind. Whether they were true or not, I couldn't say. Agnes never married after that, of course, and I have sometimes thought, though it isn't a charitable thing to say, that she never quite forgave Ethel for it, whatever face she put on for the rest of us. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence, turning it over with the same unhurried attention she gave to a dropped stitch. Her next call was upon Miss Bunthorne herself, whom she found in her small, over-furnished sitting room, the interminable scarf across her lap, knitting with the fierce concentration of a woman who finds in the repetition of a simple task a great deal of comfort against thoughts she would rather not examine too closely. "I don't wonder people are saying it wasn't an accident," said Miss Bunthorne, with something almost like satisfaction, for she was a woman who had gone through a great deal of her life, feeling that she was not sufficiently listened to, and found a certain grim pleasure in being, for once, in possession of an opinion others were obliged to consider. "I said as much myself, the very night it happened, though nobody troubled to take much notice." "You were quite right to say it, my dear," said Miss Marple. "I have thought so myself on reflection. Tell me, you knew Ethel a very long time, I think, quite as long as Mrs. Latimer." "Longer," said Miss Bunthorne, with a certain grim emphasis, and something in her face closed, very slightly, like a door being drawn quietly to. "I hope," said Miss Marple gently, "that you won't think it a very impertinent question, but I have been wondering, was there ever any unpleasantness between you? I ask only because it seems to me that whoever did this dreadful thing must have had some reason, however small it may have seemed to anyone else, and it is generally the small, old things that turn out to matter most, in my experience, far more than anything new." Miss Bunthorne's needles stopped for a moment, quite still, and then resumed their work, a shade more quickly than before. "There was something, a great many years ago," she said at last, in a voice from which she had taken great care to remove any particular feeling. "I don't see that it can have anything to do with this business, and I would rather not discuss it, if you don't mind, Miss Marple. It is a very old matter, and quite dead, and I should have thought a person's private griefs might be left to rest along with everything else." "Of course, my dear," said Miss Marple, with perfect gentleness, and did not press the point, for she had learned long ago that a door closed too firmly upon is very often opened again, in its own time, by the person who closed it, provided one does not make the mistake of trying to force it before that time comes. But she noted, all the same, with the small private satisfaction of a woman adding another stitch to a pattern only she could yet see the shape of, that Mrs. Latimer's story had been confirmed in every particular by the manner of its denial. Her third call was upon Susan Hale, the newest member of the circle, whom she found, on a bright cold afternoon, hanging out washing in the small garden behind her cottage, and who received the news of Miss Marple's visit with the slightly anxious eagerness of a young woman not yet quite certain of her place in a village where everyone else had known everyone else for the better part of a lifetime. "I hardly knew her, Miss Marple, if I'm honest," said Susan, pegging out a shirt with quick, nervous movements. "I'd only joined the circle in the spring, and Mrs. Bantry was always very much in charge of things, if you know what I mean, and I didn't like to say very much, being so new. I did think she was rather hard on Miss Bunthorne sometimes, about the scarf and one or two other things, but I dare say that was only her way and meant nothing by it." "Hard in what manner, my dear?" "Oh, little remarks. Nothing anyone could really take hold of. About how some people never finished anything they started, and how it was a pity Agnes had never found anyone to settle down with, when she'd had the chance. Susan flushed slightly, as though regretting the disclosure, even as she made it. I thought it rather unkind, at the time, though Miss Bunthorne never seemed to mind, or if she did, she never let it show. Miss Marple thanked her and walked home slowly in the fading light, turning over in her mind the small pieces she had gathered, as one turns over the pieces of a pattern not yet fully charted, and thinking, though she would have been the first to say it was very far from proof of anything, that a grievance 11 years old, nursed quietly through 11 years of small remarks and small slights, was very often a far more dangerous thing than a grievance new-minted and hot with its first anger. New anger burns itself out. Old anger, kept carefully, like a needle put away in a drawer against some future use, does not. It was not, she reminded herself firmly, walking up her own garden path as the first stars came out over the hedgerow, anything like a certainty. It was only a thread, and a very thin one, and she had been wrong before. She remembered, with a small private wince, the affair of the Henderson's spaniel, in which she had been quite convinced of the wrong explanation for the better part of a fortnight, until the true one had presented itself in a manner so simple she had felt thoroughly foolish for not having seen it sooner. But a thread, however thin, was a thing to be followed, and Miss Marple intended to follow this one wherever it led, even if it led, as she rather suspected it might, to a needle put away 11 years ago, and taken out again only once. The wrong set. There is a particular danger, well known to anyone who has ever tried to solve a puzzle of any kind, in finding a thread that fits so neatly into the pattern one has already half formed in one's mind that one stops looking for any other. Miss Marple, who prided herself, not without reason, on a lifetime's habit of suspecting the obvious explanation precisely because it was obvious, fell nonetheless, over the course of the following few days, into very much this trap, a fact she would own to quite readily, afterwards, though it cost her a certain amount of private embarrassment at the time. The old grievance between Ethel Bantry and Agnes Bunthorne sat in her mind like a bright thread among duller ones, and the more she considered it, the more it seemed to her to explain a great deal. An old wound, nursed quietly for 11 years through 100 small unkindnesses, the remarks about the scarf, the remarks about Mr. Fenwick and the marriage that never came, and then perhaps some final small unkindness on that last Thursday evening, spoken while the others were occupied in the hall with coats, that had tipped an old and patient anger over into something final and terrible. It fitted. It fitted rather too well, as Miss Marple was later obliged to admit to herself, and she had not, for several days, troubled to ask herself why a woman who had borne 11 years of small slights with every appearance of patience should suddenly, on one Thursday evening, no different from any other, find herself unable to bear one slight more. She called upon Miss Bunthorne again, on the Tuesday, with what she told herself was no very particular purpose beyond ordinary friendliness, but with an attention, all the same, sharpened by her own private theory, to every detail of the small sitting-room, the work-basket by the chair, the wool, and, most particularly, the needles. Miss Bunthorne was at her scarf, as always, and greeted Miss Marple's arrival with rather less warmth than usual, having perhaps some instinct, sharpened by long years of feeling herself watched and found wanting by the village at large, that this was not entirely a social call. "You are still working on the scarf, I see," said Miss Marple, settling herself with her own small piece of knitting, for she rarely called anywhere without some work of her own in her bag, it being, she always said, a great help to conversation to have one's hands occupied and one's eyes free to wander where they would. "I don't suppose I shall ever finish it," said Miss Bunthorne, with a short laugh that held very little humour in it. "I sometimes think I don't want to. As long as I'm knitting it, nobody expects me to knit anything else, and nobody asks why I never wear the ones I've already made." It was, Miss Marple thought, a curiously revealing thing to say, and she noted it, along with everything else, in the quiet, unhurried filing away of small facts that constituted, for her, the greater part of any investigation. But it was the needles she had come to see, and after a little more conversation, about the weather, and about Mrs. Pruitt's tiresome heart, and about whether the church sale should, after all, be moved forward a fortnight, a question that seemed, in Ethel's absence, curiously without an obvious authority to settle it, she found occasion to admire the wool in Miss Bunthorne's basket, and, in doing so, to look rather more closely than politeness might strictly have allowed at the needles that lay within it. There were 2 pairs, one in use, holding the endless scarf, and a second, smaller pair, of the size used for a finer wool, lying loose at the bottom of the basket, among some odd balls of yarn. "You have a great many needles, my dear," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I always seem to lose mine, myself. I don't think I have ever owned a full pair for longer than a 12-month without one of them wandering off somewhere never to be seen again. I keep mine very carefully," said Miss Bunthorne, with a touch of stiffness, as though the remark had been a small criticism, which perhaps, in its way, it had been intended to be, though not consciously. "I don't like to lose things. I've had that second pair 11 years, and never mislaid either one of them." 11 years. Miss Marple's needles paused, very briefly, over her own work. It was, she told herself afterwards, a foolish thing to have made so much of, a figure that might have applied to 100 pairs of needles in 100 work baskets in the village, and meant nothing at all beyond the ordinary durability of good steel. But coming as it did, hard upon her own private theory of an 11-year-old grievance, it struck her with a force quite disproportionate to its actual significance, and she went home that evening, more than half convinced that she had found her answer. It was Sir Henry Clithering, for Miss Marple's nephew Raymond had, as it happened, brought that gentleman down to Mead for a few days' shooting, and Sir Henry, hearing something of the business from Raymond over dinner, had walked over one afternoon to pay his respects to Miss Marple, and to hear, as he put it, the true story, since I have no doubt at all that what Raymond has told me is a very garbled version of it. It was Sir Henry, sitting with her in her own small drawing-room over a cup of tea, who first gave her pause. "You're quite certain of this, Miss Bunthorne, are you?" he asked, when Miss Marple had laid out, with her customary care, the whole small structure of grievance and needle, and 11 years that she had built. "I am not at all certain," said Miss Marple, a little sharply, for she did not care to have her caution mistaken for conviction. "And I hope I have not given you that impression, Sir Henry, for it would be a very unjust thing to do, to a woman who has done nothing, so far, but knit an unfortunate scarf, and lose an old fiancé to an unkind letter, a great many years ago. I only say that it is a thread, and one I mean to follow, but I own I have been thinking of very little else these 3 days, and that is not, in my experience, a good sign. When one thread absorbs all of one's attention, one is generally in some danger of not looking carefully enough at the others." "Very sound," said Sir Henry, with the ghost of a smile, "though I notice you have not, even now, quite let go of it." "No," admitted Miss Marple, a little ruefully, "I have not. It is a very natural fault, Sir Henry, and I do not say I am above it, however much I know I ought to be. An old grudge, sharpened by 11 years, it explains so much, you see, that one is tempted to let it explain everything, and to stop asking whether there might not be some other explanation that fits the facts very nearly as well, and has simply not yet occurred to one." It was 2 days later, calling once more upon Miss Prentice, this time on the pretext of returning a pattern book she had borrowed, though in truth she had begun to feel a certain unease about her own conclusions, and wished, without quite admitting it to herself, to look once more at the scene of the thing with a mind less made up than it had lately become, that Miss Marple received the small, sharp check that was to set her thinking, once again, along an entirely different road. She had asked, almost idly, whether Miss Prentice happened to remember what each of the ladies had been working on that last Thursday evening, a question she had not troubled to ask before, having been, as she was obliged to admit, rather too occupied with Miss Bunthorne's scarf and Miss Bunthorne's history to attend properly to anyone else's. "Let me think," said Miss Prentice, wrinkling her brow in the effort of memory. Ethel was doing the border for the jumble sale blanket, of course. We all were, really. We'd each taken a section. Agnes had her scarf, as always. Mrs. Latimer was on her booties, unpicking them for the third time. I shouldn't wonder. Susan was making some little thing for her sister's baby, I think, and I was doing my own square of the blanket. She paused. Oh, and I remember now, quite clearly, because it struck me as a little odd at the time. Ethel asked to borrow a needle from someone, partway through the evening. She said she'd dropped one of her own into the fire fender and couldn't find it, and didn't like to hunt for it on her hands and knees at her age, and would someone lend her a spare until she could look for it properly in the daylight. Miss Marple sat very still. "And did someone lend her one, my dear?" "Why, yes," said Miss Prentice. I believe it was Susan who had a spare in her bag, and lent it to her without a second thought. It seemed such a small thing at the time, I'd quite forgotten it until this moment." "It was," Miss Marple reflected, walking home a little later, with the pattern book returned, and a great deal more to think about than she had brought with her, a very salutary lesson, and one she did not intend to forget in a hurry, that a theory built upon an old grievance, and an unfinished scarf, however neatly it seemed to fit, was worth a great deal less than a single fact, however small, that nobody had troubled to mention, because nobody had troubled to ask. For if it was Susan Hale's needle that Ethel had borrowed that evening, Susan Hale, who had known Ethel scarcely 6 months, and could have no 11-year-old grievance against her, and had seemed, on Miss Marple's earlier visit, the very picture of a young woman with nothing whatever to hide, then either the needle that killed Ethel Bantry was an innocent loan that had nothing to do with her death at all, and the true weapon lay yet undiscovered somewhere else entirely, or else Miss Marple's whole comfortable theory of old grudges and 11-year-old wounds was built, as she was now very much afraid it was, upon exactly the wrong foundation. The truth in the wool basket. Miss Marple went to see Susan Hale the very next morning, and this time she did not trouble herself with any preliminary talk of washing or weather, for she had learned, over a great many years, that when a matter has grown urgent, it is generally better to come to it directly, however much good manners might otherwise recommend a more leisurely approach. "My dear," she said, when Susan had brought her into the small sitting room and they were seated, "I wonder if I might ask you something rather particular. Miss Prentice tells me that on the evening Ethel died, she borrowed a needle from you, that she had dropped one of her own and did not care to search for it. Is that so?" Susan flushed, as she had a tendency to do whenever the subject of that evening was raised, though whether from guilt or merely from the natural discomfort of a young woman drawn, quite against her own wishes, into the middle of a dreadful business, Miss Marple could not yet be certain. "Yes," she said, "I had a spare in my bag. I always carry an odd one or two, in case I drop one, for I'm dreadfully careless that way. I gave it to her without thinking anything of it at all." "And did she return it to you, before you left that evening?" Susan considered. No, I don't believe she did. I quite forgot about it, if I'm honest, until this moment. I never thought to ask for it back, and in all the dreadful confusion afterwards, it went quite out of my mind." "Then it ought still to be among her things," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Or else it was the very needle that— well, but I understood from Constable Palk that no second needle was found near the chair that evening, nor anywhere in the room, though he looked, at my asking. If Ethel had your needle in her possession still, and it was not the one used against her, then where did it go?" This was a question to which Susan had no answer, and Miss Marple did not press her further, but went away with a small, precise piece added to the pattern she was building, and a suspicion, not yet fully formed, that the needle Susan had lent was neither the murder weapon nor a clue of any great importance in itself, but merely what it appeared to be, a small kindness, offered and then swallowed up, as small kindnesses so often are, in the general confusion of a terrible evening. It was Dr. Haydock, encountered quite by chance in the village that afternoon as Miss Marple was returning from the post office, who was able to settle the matter beyond doubt. "As it happens," he said, when she had put her question to him, "I can tell you something about that. When we went through poor Mrs. Bantry's things afterwards, her coat pockets and so forth, there was a spare needle in her handbag, wrapped in a scrap of tissue. I noticed it particularly because it seemed such an odd thing to be carrying about, wrapped up so carefully, and I mentioned it to Palk at the time, though I don't suppose he thought it worth following up. "That," said Miss Marple, with a small sigh of something like relief, "will be Susan's needle, put away for safekeeping until it could be returned, exactly as a careful woman would do with a borrowed thing." "I am very glad to have that settled, Dr. Haydock, though it does mean I must go back to the very beginning again, for I had built a good deal upon the wrong foundation, and I am afraid I must now take it all down again and start afresh." She said this with more equanimity than she perhaps felt, for there is always something a little humbling in discovering that a theory one has nursed for the better part of a week, and grown rather fond of, must be abandoned. But Miss Marple had long ago made her peace with the fact that being wrong was a necessary and even a useful part of eventually being right, provided one did not cling too long to an error out of mere reluctance to admit it. She spent that evening by her own fire, not knitting for once, but simply sitting with her hands folded, turning the whole business over from the beginning, as one might turn a garment inside out to examine the stitching more closely. 6 women in a room, 5 of them gone home by 10:30, each seen out, each accounted for by Miss Prentice herself, Ethel alone by the fire, and then Ethel dead, with a needle in her chest that belonged to none of the 5, for Susan's, it now appeared, had been safely tucked away in Ethel's own handbag, untouched. None of the 5, Miss Marple reminded herself, except that this left, when she came to count them over again with proper care, not 5 suspects but 6, for she had been so occupied with the guests that she had quite failed, until this moment, to give proper consideration to her hostess. It was not a comfortable thought, and Miss Marple did not arrive at it easily, for she had known Amelia Prentice a great many years, and had always found her a kind, if somewhat fussy woman, entirely without the sort of hard edge that one associates, rightly or wrongly, with violence. But Miss Marple had also learned, over a great many years of watching human nature, in a great many drawing rooms very like this one, that kindness and fussiness were no more a guarantee against desperation than any other quality, and that the gentlest seeming people were sometimes driven to the gravest acts, not because they were secretly hard, but because they had, at some point, run out of any other way to protect something they could not bear to lose. She called upon Miss Prentice again the following morning, and this time she asked, with every appearance of idle curiosity, whether she might see the old work-basket that stood in the corner of the drawing-room, the one, she said, that she remembered Amelia using years ago, before her hands had grown troublesome and she had taken to the lighter plastic needles that were so much kinder to stiff fingers. Miss Prentice brought it out readily enough, with no sign of any particular unease, and Miss Marple went through its contents with the same unhurried, apparently aimless attention she had given to Miss Bunthorne's basket some days before. Old patterns, odd buttons, a thimble worn quite thin with use, and, at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of faded flannel, a single steel needle of an old-fashioned bone-handled sort, its fellow nowhere to be found. "You don't use these any more, I think, Amelia?" said Miss Marple, holding it up. "Not for years," said Miss Prentice, without any particular change in her manner. "My hands won't manage the steel ones now, not for long together. I keep that old pair for sentiment more than anything. They were a wedding present, you know, a very long time ago." "A pair," said Miss Marple gently. "But there is only one here, my dear." For a moment, Miss Prentice said nothing at all, and in the silence, Miss Marple watched something move across her old friend's face, not the sudden shock of a woman hearing an accusation for the first time, but something slower and more tired, the look of a person who has been waiting, for some days now, for a question she knew must come eventually, and finds, now that it has come, a curious and almost unwelcome relief in no longer having to wait for it. "I wondered," said Miss Prentice at last, very quietly, "how long it would take you, Jane. I rather hoped it would take longer. I am ashamed to say that." Miss Marple did not speak. She had learned, over the years, that silence, offered gently and without judgment, drew more truth from a troubled heart than any amount of questioning. And she waited now, her hands folded in her lap, while Amelia Prentice, in the fading light of her own drawing-room, began at last to tell her the whole of it. Miss Marple's last word. "It was the roof," said Miss Prentice, and there was something almost absurd in the smallness of the words, set against everything that had followed from them, so that for a moment Miss Marple wondered if she had misheard. "The church roof, Jane. You'll remember, we had all been raising money for it, the jumble sales and the blanket squares and all the rest of it, and I had been made treasurer of the fund, because nobody else wanted the bother of the accounts, and I am good with figures, or I always thought I was." "I remember," said Miss Marple. "You have kept the fund for a great many years, I think." 11 years, said Miss Prentice, and her hands, folded in her lap, twisted a little at the words, as though they cost her something to say. "And for most of that time, I kept it honestly, Jane, whatever you may think of me now. But 4 years ago my brother Frank wrote to me from Canada, in the most dreadful trouble, owing money he could not pay, and threatening, well, I need not tell you what he threatened, except that I could not have borne to see it happen, my own brother, the only family I had left in the world. I took the money from the fund. I meant to put it back within the 12-month. I promise you I meant to. But one debt led to another with poor Frank, and the 12-month became 2 years, and then 4, and every year the account grew a little further from what it ought to have been. And every year I found some small excuse to explain the shortfall to myself, if never quite to anyone else." "And Ethel found out," said Miss Marple, very gently. Miss Prentice nodded, and for a moment could not speak at all. She had always had a sharp eye for figures, sharper than mine, I'm sorry to say, whatever I told myself. She came to me a fortnight before she died, very quietly, when no one else was by, and told me she had been going over the fund accounts for the roof committee, and that they did not add up, and that she thought I had better explain myself before she was obliged to take the matter to the vicar. Miss Prentice's voice, which had been almost steady until now, began at last to shake. "I begged her, Jane. I am not ashamed to tell you that I went down on my knees to her, very nearly, and begged her to give me a little time, only a little, until I could find some way to make it right, for I had a small sum coming to me from an aunt's estate, and I was certain, quite certain, that I could set it all straight within the month, if only she would say nothing until then." "And she would not agree," said Miss Marple. "She would not." A terrible small bitterness crept into Miss Prentice's voice, the bitterness of 11 years of small deference, finally curdling into something else. She said it was not a matter she could simply overlook, that the church's money was not hers to be generous with, on my behalf, and that I had had 4 years already to set it right, and had done nothing. She was quite composed about it, quite reasonable. That was the dreadful part of it, Jane. She was not even unkind, only immovable, the way she always was about the prizes, or the flower show, or anything at all she had made up her mind upon. And I understood, listening to her, that she meant every word, and that within a very few days the whole village would know that Amelia Prentice, who had kept the roof fund so carefully for 11 years, was nothing but a common thief. "So, you asked her to stay behind, that Thursday evening," said Miss Marple, when the others had gone. "I did not plan it, Jane. I want you to believe that, whatever else you believe of me. I had gone up to see to Mrs. Latimer's coat, exactly as I told the constable, and when I came down, I meant only to speak to her once more, to try once more to move her, though I already knew in my heart it was hopeless. And there she sat, so comfortable, so certain of herself, with her feet up and her eyes half closed by the fire, and my own old needles were lying on the mantelpiece where I had left them that very morning, meaning to mend a torn hem, and I hardly knew what I was doing until it was done. It was over in a moment, a single moment, Jane, after 11 years of being afraid, and then it was too late to be anything but what I had made myself." She stopped and put her face in her hands, and Miss Marple, watching her old friend weep in the fading afternoon light, felt none of the satisfaction that is sometimes supposed to attend the solving of a mystery, but only a great and weary sadness, of the kind she had felt once or twice before in her long life, when the solution to a puzzle turned out to be not a stranger's wickedness, but an old friend's despair. "You must tell Dr. Haydock, my dear," she said at last, very gently, "or I am afraid I shall have to tell him for you, and I would very much rather it came from yourself. It will go easier for you that way, I think, and it is, in any case, the only honest course left to you now." Miss Prentice nodded, still weeping, and made no protest at all, as though the confession itself had already lifted from her some portion of a weight she had carried, in growing terror, for a fortnight, and, in a smaller and more constant way, for 4 years before that. It was a week later, and the last of the autumn leaves were coming down thickly over the lane, when Miss Marple sat once more in Sir Henry Clithering's company, this time in his own rooms at Mead, with Raymond present to hear, as he said, "the proper account, Aunt Jane, and not the very inadequate one Sir Henry got from the village gossip." "I confess," said Sir Henry, when she had told it all, from the last stitch of that Thursday evening to Amelia Prentice's confession in her own drawing-room, "that I should never have looked twice at Miss Prentice. She seemed to me, from everything Raymond told me of the business, quite the least likely of the 6. "That is very often the way of it, Sir Henry," said Miss Marple, taking up her knitting again, with an air of settling back into her ordinary self after the strangeness of the past fortnight. "We none of us like to think that a kind, fussy, rather anxious woman who has poured our tea 100 times and worried over her dropped stitches could be capable of such a thing. And the terrible truth is that it is very often exactly such a woman who is driven to it, because she has spent her whole life being agreeable and accommodating and never once learning how to simply say no to a debt, or to a brother, or to her own fear of disgrace, until the fear grows so large that it drives her, in one dreadful moment, to something she would never in her right senses have believed herself capable of." "And your first theory, poor Miss Bunthorne and her scarf?" Miss Marple had the grace to look a little rueful. "I was quite wrong about that, and I do not mind admitting it, for I think it is a useful thing to admit when one has been wrong, rather than pretending one arrived at the truth in a single straight line, which is very rarely how it happens. I had found an old grievance, and it fitted so comfortably into the shape I had already half made in my mind that I very nearly stopped looking for anything else, which is, I think, one of the most dangerous habits a person can fall into, in matters of this kind, or indeed in any other. It was only the smallest of facts, a borrowed needle, mentioned quite by chance, that set me looking in the right direction again, and I own I was very glad of it, for I should have been most unhappy to see poor Agnes Bunthorne suffer for something she had no part in, merely because her old sorrow happened to make a neater story than the truth." "And the needle itself," said Raymond, "the one that actually did it, where had it come from, in the end?" "From Amelia's own old work-basket, that had stood in the corner of her drawing-room for years, quite forgotten by everyone but herself," said Miss Marple. "That is very often how these things happen, you know, Raymond. One does not need to look very far for a weapon, if the anger is sudden enough and the object at hand. It is not, as a rule, the strange or the far-fetched thing that does the harm, in a village or anywhere else. It is the ordinary thing, close to hand, that has been sitting quietly in a corner for years, waiting, though nobody ever suspected it, for the one moment when it would be needed." She finished her row and looked up with the mild, faintly troubled smile that Raymond had come, over the years, to recognize as her particular expression for endings of this kind. Not triumphant, never quite that, but only thoughtful, and a little sad, as though the solving of the puzzle brought with it, always, less satisfaction than sorrow for the human weakness that had made the puzzle necessary in the first place. "Poor Amelia," she said quietly, half to herself. "Poor Ethel, too, for that matter, who never meant any particular unkindness by her honesty, only had rather too much of it, and too little imagination for what despair can drive a frightened woman to. It is a very sad little story, when all is said, and not, I think, one I shall much enjoy telling, if anyone should ask me to tell it again." She returned to her knitting and said no more upon the subject that evening, though the click of her needles, steady and unhurried in the firelight, seemed to Raymond, listening, to carry within it something of the same patient, careful, faintly melancholy wisdom with which she had, in the end, unravelled the whole sad business, stitch by stitch, thread by thread, until the truth, however unwelcome, lay plain before her, as it generally did, in time.